I'm Mark Hennick. This is So-Called Normal. Hey folks, welcome to So-Called Normal. I'm Mark Hennick. Today on the show we have podcaster extraordinaire Eric Zimmer. Eric hosts the One You Feed podcast, a huge show that I had the great privilege to be a guest on, and then we had a conversation about having Eric come over onto mine as well. So I hope you really enjoy what we talked about. We talk a lot about his personal experience with addiction in particular and what he was able to learn from that. And I love the concept of Eric's show, The One You Feed, because as you'll hear in the episode, it's based on the parable of the two wolves. And the one that you choose to feed, he explains it much better than I do. But of course, your choice is the which of those two wolves you will feed. And in my personal case, I relate to that because it's this idea of hopelessness, of death, of everybody hates me, of depression and anxiety, the voices of depression and anxiety. That's one wolf versus the other, the one who gives me passion and makes me do what I do and drag myself out of bed every morning, even when I don't want to. So, that's the wolf that I try to feed with this show and with these conversations. That's my hunger to change the world, I guess. Anyway, before I torture his metaphor anymore, before I torture his parable anymore, here's my conversation with podcaster Eric Zimmer on So-Called Normal. Welcome to the show. Thanks for making the time to come on, especially after I was able to talk with you on your show not all that long ago.
Yeah, it was a real pleasure having you on, and I am glad to be here with you now.
So I'm interested in, when I'm your guest, I don't get a chance to really ask any questions or many questions of you, although I really enjoyed our conversation, and we'll certainly share that with our audience here too. But I'm always interested in knowing, for people who are the ones who ask the questions usually, as is the case for you, what your story is. Why do you do what you do? Who are you? Who is Eric Zimmer?
Well, that's a pretty big and open-ended question. I could answer that in a deep Zen sense, and I could say Eric Zimmer is no one. Or I could answer that in a more practical sense, where I would say that
Eric Zimmer is everyone.
Is everyone. That's right. No. I'm the host of the One You Feed podcast, which is a podcast where I interview people similar to you two about what it means to live a good life. I've been doing that for about it's got to be going on 6 years now. Before that, I was in the software startup industry for years. I started a solar energy company. I do behavioral coaching now. How's that for an all over the place answer?
That's a wonderful all over the place answer. Tell me more about the One You Feed, the podcast itself, but also the parable.
Yeah, the podcast is based on an old parable, and the old parable is that we all have two wolves inside of us that are always at battle. One is a good wolf, and it represents things like kindness, bravery, and love, and the other is the bad wolf, which represents things like greed and hatred and fear. And the grandfather's telling this story to his grandson, and his grandson stops and says, "Well, grandfather, which one wins?" And the grandfather says, "The one you feed." So that parable is sort of the jumping off point that I ask all my guests as a way to kind of just start conversation and go deeper.
Yeah. Why that? What initially brought you, you've been doing this for a few years now, but what was the initial attraction to that parable for you?
Well, when I first heard the parable, it really struck me very strongly. I was early in recovery from heroin addiction, and it made complete sense to me. I was at that point in my life where it had sort of been pointed out to me, like, here are the actions you can take that are going to lead to you getting better and staying alive and out of jail, or you can keep doing what you were doing, which is going to probably lead to going to jail, which I had a lot of jail time pending. I had hepatitis C, so death was in the neighborhood. And so it was just really clear to me, which of these things am I going to feed? What am I going to do day to day with my choices and my action? And so it was really powerful to me then. I'm not quite sure what brought it to mind when I thought about doing a podcast. I think I was looking maybe for an orienting principle, but it kind of just came to my mind like, oh, I could ask people that question. It would be a good jumping off point. The whole podcast kind of came to me without a whole lot of thought, to be honest.
Yeah. Yeah. Tell me more about the heroin addiction if you're comfortable digging more into that. I mean, that's a pretty powerful jumping off point or starting point in your own story, it seems.
Yeah, it was a long time ago now.
Mm-hmm.
It certainly, I guess I got sober off heroin when I was 25 years old. So that was, I won't tell everybody how long ago that was. But yeah, I was.
What was going on in your life, at that time that got you to that place, where you're addicted to heroin? I mean, give us a picture of what somebody's life looks like to get there.
Well, I don't know. It wasn't like I lived this terribly traumatic and awful life.
Right.
I grew up upper middle class. I went to high school in a decent suburban school. I was always in trouble. I was in trouble from as young as I can remember being. I just, whether it was shoplifting or stealing or vandalism or not going to school or pick your thing, I kind of was always troubled, I think. And, I won't bore everybody with all the reasons why necessarily right here. But they're kind of, the usual adverse childhood experiences, right? Not knowing how to deal with the emotions that came in my case. I think I'm probably a highly sensitive person. And so that takes some care, and I didn't get any of that. But the long and short of it was when I was 18, I started drinking. I had actually been sober, hadn't really drank before that. I did a little bit, but then I stopped because I had formed a tutoring program for inner city kids. And when I saw what drugs and alcohol were doing to those kids' families and their lives, I was like, I don't want anything to do with it.
Right.
But then I was in a lot of pain from a breakup, and somebody said, do you want to drink? And I said, sure. And I took it, and it was kind of like a switch flip.
Right.
And I was kind of off to the races for the next 6 years, really, which started with drinking and then marijuana and just sort of escalated until it was a full-scale kind of heroin addiction, and I was pretty much homeless, living in the back of a van. I mentioned I had a lot of jail time. I was in a lot of trouble with the police. It was kind of a fast descent in my case.
Do you think that, did you have an addictive personality, whatever that means anyway? Did you tend toward addiction?
Probably, although I don't know that I had a lot of chance to really explore it necessarily. Sure. But yeah, I was always a little intense.
Yeah. Now,
I was always intense.
And do you think that you mentioned as a highly sensitive person and as a guy at that, was that something that wasn't, my own experience personally is that you never really learn as a guy how to talk about your emotions because you're not supposed to feel emotions because you're a man, right? I don't know if you had that kind of experience too, but did you feel that you were at a disadvantage for being a male and a highly sensitive male at that?
Yeah, I don't think I could have articulated any of that probably at that time.
I can still barely do that. Yeah.
I think what probably happened to me was as a reaction to the masculinity around me, I may have embraced feeling too strongly.
Right.
I may have gone too far into I'll feel whatever is there to feel, It's that, the question I always think is so funny is, which came first, the depression or the listening to the Smiths and the Cure kind of thing, right? Like what precedes what?
Not to say anything against the Smiths and the Cure.
No, I love those bands, but it's fairly morose for to be, I think about some of the lines from some of those songs now and I look back and I'm like, my goodness, at like 17, I'm singing songs about how my life is over. And I'm like, I was 17. I mean, it was just, so I don't know what all was there, but I do know that when alcohol got reintroduced, I took to it like a drowning person. I was rarely sober from when I started until I got sober. It was full speed ahead for me.
Yeah.
And it was an answer for me for a long time. I loved it. And it I think it made me feel wonderful for a long time until, of course, it didn't.
Well, that's something I've talked to a few people on the show so far who have battled addiction, and it seems like many of them who go that route are running from something, escaping, often trauma, or they like the social interaction. They like the groups of friends. They like being a part of something else. What do you think it was for you, or maybe a combination of both?
I think for me, it's probably a combination, but I think for me that what drugs mostly did for me, drugs and alcohol, and And it's hard to say because heroin was at the tail end of a pretty long stretch of drinking. But I think in general, what drugs and alcohol do for me is they actually connect me to life.
Okay.
I think that in the absence of them, I can feel fairly dead inside.
Right.
I've dealt with depression, ever since I got sober, and my depression is the sort of classic just dead inside feeling.
Right.
And so what happens is alcohol and drugs for me, they wake me up to life. I'm like, yes, I want to do this and I want to do that. There's an old line in an old movie called Days of Wine and Roses, and one of the characters, when she's trying to get sober, she says this line, and it's always struck with me. When I'm, normal life is like black and white to me, but when I drink, it's like the colors all come on. Right. And I think that summarizes me. Now, how did I get to that stage? I don't know. How did I get dead? Probably by trying not to feel things when it was when I was told it was not appropriate to feel them, or maybe it's just a genetic. My family, depression seems to run in it. So I don't know. But for me, it seemed to me less an escape than it was. Well, it was an escape. It was escape from feeling dead inside.
Right. So now, you must use that experience yourself every day doing your own podcast and talking to people, I would think. I mean, I can certainly relate to a number of the things that you're sharing. Has that been your experience with guests you've had on your show too?
Well, I stayed sober about 9 years at that point after I got sober. And then I went out and I drank again for a few years. And now I've been back about 12 or 13 years. So yeah, I do use those experiences. I mean, they're interwoven into who I am. I don't think there's any separating them out for me. Who would I be without those feels like a nonsensical question.
Right.
I have no idea who I would be. My whole adult life largely has either been sober or in sobriety, but it's been a big part of who I am, I guess.
Sure. I've thought a lot about this in terms of the worst things in our life, the worst aspects of us, and what we're challenging ourselves to find what we're grateful for in the struggle. Not to silver lining it or make it Pollyannish or anything like that, but what else are you going to do, right? Might as well, at least this is how I've treated my own struggle, is I might as well use it for something good, ideally. So sometimes for people this is challenging, but is there anything that you're grateful for in these worst moments of your life?
Well, I guess from where I sit, I'm grateful for all of them. Again, because I couldn't imagine who I would be without them. I doubt I'd be doing a podcast about spiritual, mental, and emotional health if I hadn't had those issues.
Right. So the spiritual piece, do you find that comes in? I mean, that's what the podcast is about, sure, but does that come into these equations a lot for you?
I think, it's interesting. I'm involved in a program for training of spiritual directors. And one of the things I've had to do is think about a spiritual autobiography. So I've kind of been thinking about these ideas, right? And I think spirituality is a big part of my life. In the 12-step program, they say you need to find a higher power in order to stay sober. And I think that all my drugs and alcohol was a search for connection. And I do think that's what spirituality is about for me. It's about a deeper connection. And that connection can look lots of different ways depending on how you want to define it. It can be to yourself. It can be to others. It can be to something bigger. It can be to a divine being. It can be to nature. But I think connection is kind of the name of the game. And so that's kind of, for me, what my spirituality has been about. Spirituality to me is just sort of a understanding that there's something deeper going on than what appears on the surface.
Right. And have you channeled that? I guess the way to speak of it is channeling it, but have you channeled that into a religion, a particular religious tradition, or do you identify more as spiritual but not religious?
I think I would identify as spiritual but not religious overall, although I've been mostly drawn to Buddhism over the years, and in the not too distant past started really studying Zen more deeply, or I wouldn't even say studying, working with a Zen teacher more deeply. One of the challenges of a profession like mine is I talk to a different person every week who has their own program for how you get better, And so what I end up finding is I'm doing a little of this and a little of that, and I'm hopping all over the place. And I finally hit a point where I was like, well, what I need for my own life is to pick an area and go, try and go really deep in. So for me right now, it's Zen.
Yeah. So what is it about Zen that attracts you?
I can't articulate it.
Which is probably the whole point of Zen, right?
Yeah. To some extent. I mean, I was first introduced to Zen when I was in high school. It was probably the first spiritual interest of mine. And I loved the aesthetic and I loved the idea. I think I right away got some sense that there was a way to live with my mind in a more peaceful state without having to change external conditions.
Right.
But I do like Zen. Zen seems very simple. It seems very direct and it seems very intense. And those are all qualities that I like.
You certainly are much better versed in it than I am, but I've, from my elementary knowledge, have really responded as well to the idea of the practice, that it's not something that's necessarily, not at all, given to you. It's not revealed to you necessarily, but that it's something that you work toward. Is that a fair estimation of the activity?
It is. I think, all Buddhist traditions will say that ultimately this is something to be done, not something to contemplate. But Zen is really strong on that point. I read a line the other day that trying to understand this, through your intellect is trying to like hit the moon out of the sky with a stick,
Right.
So Zen gives me a lot of encouragement, which I need to not make this an intellectual process. I've done a lot of reading on spiritual things over all the years. And I've done a fair amount of practice, but I haven't done as much practice as I've done reading by a long shot. And so I need encouragement to practice, to do instead of learn and read.
What has that practice taught you so far? Because I think it's always a lifelong learning journey. What's it taught you so far about the difficult emotions and that desire to be sometimes it can be sometimes a pathological desire to connect. I know that sounds kind of strange, but sometimes we're so desperate that we can't just be alone and be silent with ourselves because we're so desperate to be surrounded by others or connected with others. What has it taught you about sitting with difficult emotions?
Well, I think it's taught me that they're not to be feared as much as I thought they were. Now, nobody likes them and I don't like them, right? But if I had to sum up the Buddhist teaching in one sentence, which will get me in trouble with all kinds of Buddhists, would basically be like, don't run away from the difficult emotions. You can face them and you can see what they're like. And ultimately what you'll realize is that they are just waves that pass through. Now, this is people who have severe trauma. This is a different animal. And I like to call that out, right? Like, I don't think it's not a good idea necessarily if you had severe trauma to sit down and go, oh, I'll bring up the worst emotion and sit here with it. Right. So,
yeah.
But in general, that's what, kind of what I get from Buddhism about dealing with difficult emotions is that we can try and make them go away. And there's lots of strategies to do it. I would say my life has been a long experiment in increasingly refined and sophisticated ways to not feel bad. Going from the really, clearly bad idea, like putting a needle in my arm, that's a pretty strong reaction to not liking how you feel. But I've gotten increasingly sophisticated, right? And the most sophisticated form of it is, okay, I won't turn away from them, which then, of course, turns into, for a lot of us, we hear like, well, just sit with the emotion. So we sit with the emotion. And I'm like, all right, I sat with the emotion for like a minute. Why is it not gone yet? And so, but I think that's the path. There was a line that we had a guest named David K. Reynolds on. And I don't know why I always come back to this line, but it really strikes me. And he said that when you're in control of your behavior, you become free to feel your emotions fully. And that really hit me because when I was not in control of my behavior, particularly bad emotions could send me to some pretty bad places. But once I was in control of my behavior and I knew that I wasn't going to run off and get drunk or start doing drugs, or I wasn't going to do anything destructive, all of a sudden I could sort of just allow the feelings to be there more and allow them to kind of come and go. And that was a big turning point for me when I realized like, oh, a feeling can come and it can pass. There's a phrase I love, which is emotions are not emergencies. But for a lot of us, they are. They feel like they're an emergency and we have to do something. And that's where it's one of the practices of Buddhism helps you to sort of, mindfulness helps you to sort of tweeze apart what's going on in an emotion, because they can be very overwhelming. But when you can sort of stop and start to tweeze them apart, you start to go, okay, well, there's a feeling here in my body, and there's a thought that's here in my head, and there's another thought that's running off telling me what the future is going to be like. And when you start to take those things apart, none of them individually are as overwhelming as the whole package. But when the whole package shows up, boom, like that, then it's like, oh, I can't take it. And we run away.
Yeah, especially you have no idea how to deal with it. It's almost like the secret to happiness is realizing that it's okay to be unhappy.
Yeah, there's a lot to that. Yeah. And so I think, the Buddhist practice of mindfulness or meditation, and they're not the same thing, but sometimes they are, has helped me to sort of be able to take those big globs of yucky feeling stuff and tweeze them apart enough that none of them are so bad feeling that I can't cope with them.
Now, do you think that's the reason that we so often, feed the wolf, to use the parable that you use, to feed the wolf that doesn't serve us, that's more of the reacting, mindless reacting, than it is either non-reactivity or responding in a more mindful way? Is it that we're just reacting out of impulse, I guess? Is that what causes that?
I think I would say I think we are reacting. I do think that most things come out of reaction. I don't know if I would say it's always impulsive, because I think there's a lot of cultural conditioning also.
Sure.
I think that embedded in the human sort of condition is, well, actually in any living being condition, is move away from what's painful, move towards what's pleasant. We can see it at the most basic cellular level. So that's sort of built into us. But I think that when we're not a little bit more clear on what wise action is, we end up feeding the bad wolf. So a lot of times it's reactive. Yes, it's, I don't feel good, so I take a drug, I take a drink, I eat, right? But there's also some pretty culturally embedded things that are a lot deeper than, they're not just momentary reactions. And this, I would look at something like greed, right? Greed is a deeper, longer term approach to life.
Yeah. And I think that even the concepts of pain and pleasure too are to a degree culturally and personally conditioned, things that are, for example, I've relatively recently taken up the practice of going into a sauna and then taking a nice cold shower in cycles. I don't know why I got that idea. Somebody told me it was a good idea, and it was miserable. It's as miserable as it sounds at first. But now I find I actually crave it, and I take a lot of pleasure from doing that, because it actually does feel good once you get into that kind of habit and practice. So I think that, not to say that everybody should go out and take ice cold showers after baking themselves, but I think that what we learn to find pleasurable or painful, or well, that's it actually, that we learn to find certain things pleasurable and certain things painful based on that which we've conditioned to find pleasurable or painful.
Yes, there is certainly a fair amount of that. We are very conditioned beings. That's another key teaching of Buddhism, is we don't really see the world as it is. We see the world as we are. I'm paraphrasing Stephen Covey, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People there, but that's pretty much a Buddhist idea. We are everything is a result of causes and conditions.
Yeah. Yeah. So what have you found? How many people have you interviewed for your podcast? An estimation, unless you know.
280 some.
280 some. Wow. Any common themes that you've noticed over that 280 plus interviews?
It's interesting because I don't know. Well, yeah, there's lots of common themes, and I sometimes try and direct the people I'm talking to towards certain themes, because I sort of see them as part of the show. And what I'm trying to do with the show is, yes, I want to present people's work clearly and authentically, but I also, I try and orient the show so that people are getting a similar message over and over, because I think we need to hear things about 25,000 times before they sink in sometimes. But I think some of the common ones are, we just touched on one of them, right? Don't avoid your emotions. That doesn't really work.
Right.
I think another one that's really there an awful lot is that action matters, right? I say this phrase all the time. Sometimes you can't think your way into right action. You have to act your way into right thinking. Right. So, what we do matters. Our actions really matter, and our actions can actually change our moods. And so, action matters. That's another one. I think another one that was a little more surprising to me has been about the importance of connection to other people. Mm-hmm. I think I came from more of a Buddhist background where I thought the answer is within, right? If you just go within and, go sit in a cave long enough, you'll find all the answers, right? And while I believe there's some truth to that, it's become abundantly clear that a good life really does involve having good, strong connections around you.
And
so
we can't be a closed. We're not a closed system as people.
We are not.
Right?
We are not. Nope.
So then how do we, what are some of the lessons that you've learned from other people that hasn't come from, within the echo chamber within your own mind, seeking nirvana or whatever it is. But, sometimes I notice that, and I think you mentioned that you're a dad. Sometimes we can learn more from our kids than we ever thought possible. We can learn more from the things that challenge us the most than we thought possible. So what have been some of those lessons that you couldn't have discovered from within?
Well, I think one is just how hard it is to change anyone else. I heard a quote the other day that said, essentially, if you realized how hard it is to change yourself, you would realize the utter impossibility of changing anyone else.
Right.
And so if you have kids or, you don't even have to have kids to have that, you start to really realize like there's only so much that we can do to get someone else to change.
Right.
People change on their own time when they're ready, and we can encourage that process. We can help facilitate it, but we sure can't make it happen.
Yeah. When did you reach that state of change where you realized that something had to give? When you're experiencing your addiction, that is.
Probably about 2 years before I actually got sober.
Oh yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, I started making attempts to get sober. I mean, I hit the oh man, something's got to change phase a bunch of times, and I tried all sorts of things that were not really good. Like, oh, I'll just move away. If I move away, that'll work. I actually tried that one twice. Didn't work. So there were, I think, multiple years before I actually got sober. I think my sobriety process was a little bit of, I think there were two things that were happening in parallel. One was I was learning what it might actually take to get sober. Like, oh, okay. I'd go somewhere and they'd say, well, in order to get sober, you need to do A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. And I go, all right, I'll do A. Mm-hmm. Right. And then I wouldn't get sober. And then I'd come back again. They'd say, you got to do A through G. And I'd say, well, I'll try A and B this time, until eventually I found the point where I was kind of like, these are all the things I need to do. I became really willing. Right. And then I think the other process there of learning was really learning that there was nothing left for me in drugs and alcohol. The problem with those things is that they do work for a long time or people wouldn't do them. Right. And they often will still at the end, if your life is so miserable, such as mine was, they'll give you 15 minutes of relief. And 15 minutes of relief can seem like an awful lot in that wasteland of misery. Right. And so I think, those are the two things that anybody who's getting sober kind of works their way through. They learn what it's going to take to get sober, what are the actions, and they hit a point where they really see for themselves very clearly, like there's nothing left there.
Yeah, I read a little bit of research, or reporting on some research, I should say, that was fairly controversial at the time, and I think still would be, that many addictions, and it depends on the substance, has a certain lifespan, essentially. It sounds similar to what you're talking about. That's what reminded me of it, that they tend to, start with the proverbial gateway kind of ramp up. They peak, and then something's got to give. The ground falls out, and then they fade away. Is that something that you think is accurate from your experience on the ground, or is there something else going on there? Does it follow a different trajectory?
No, I think a lot of people do outgrow it. Right? If you went to a college campus on any weekend, you would see a whole bunch of people who met several of the definitions of alcoholism.
Right. Yeah, sure. Right? Yeah.
Like blackout drinking continuously, continuing to drink when you have consequences, right? But the vast majority of those people will outgrow it as a problem. Right. And I'm not even saying they're alcoholics now. I'm just saying that the vast majority of people will engage in behavior with substances that is not healthy. If you saw an adult doing it, you'd be like, what is the matter with you?
Like, well, and it's a different context too, right?
It's a different context. So most people do outgrow it. A lot of people don't. Right. And so yes, the literature on addiction is so confounding, right? Because the honest truth is nobody knows how to fix it consistently, right? AA has, you can go to an AA meeting or anywhere in the world tonight and find lots of people who have been sober a long time. Mm-hmm. So to say that AA doesn't work is nonsense. It does work. Mm-hmm. There are people out there who are sober, lots of them. But does it work for everybody? By no stretch of the imagination does it, right? And so the truth is it's so complex. We don't know really. I believe when people are really honest, and most people don't necessarily want to be honest because they've got a book or something to sell. But when we're really honest, the honest truth is we don't know how. We don't know what it is that caused me to get sober and 20 other people I started trying to get sober with to not. Right.
Well, I mean,
a lot of those people are dead.
Yeah, the reality is that there's probably, like with mental illness or anything else, there's probably many different pathways to get to that state, and that probably is what at least partially determines the many different pathways to recovery, is matching the right type of recovery, the right intervention to the way that you got there in the first place might depend.
That's very well said. Yes, that is true. And then I also think, there are, like mental health, a severe mental health diagnosis, a severe addiction diagnosis, your whole life is kind of upside down. And so, we can look at things like getting people into treatment, but things really matter. Like, do they have a job to come back to? Do they have a safe place to come back to? Do women who are getting sober have access to childcare so they can go to meetings? The number of factors is nearly endless, right? And so yeah, it's really hard to know what will get some people sober, but people do. Lots of people do, and there are. I've met a good number of people who were like, they were 40, they've been drinking their whole life. They finally said that's it, and they stopped.
Right, and that was it.
That was it. Yeah. So it's, I think what you said is a really good one. I think, where are they when they that leads them into alcohol or addiction? What is it that caused it? How bad has the deterioration of the brain been? These things are, these things are bad on the brain. What's the, I had this conversation with Gabor Mate once, who's a trauma specialist and an addiction specialist.
A great Canadian as well.
Yes, indeed. And his perspective was, that the more damaged somebody is, the harder the chance is they're going to recover.
Yeah.
And I think, I don't think any of us should say I'm too damaged. I don't think that's a useful way to look at it, right? But I think it does allow us to extend some compassion, particularly people who've been able to get sober and look at everybody else. You're like, well, if you just did what I did, you'd get sober. Well, it's not really that simple.
Do we hold some responsibility as a society for allowing people to get that damaged? Or is it, there are some who view it as all their fault, essentially, that they chose to use those drugs or they chose to be that way. Which end of the spectrum do you fall on?
I fall in the middle of almost any spectrum. And I would probably fall in the middle here. I mean, ultimately, yes, if somebody, there's a lot of evidence that points to if you have a certain number of adverse childhood experiences, right, you're going to become an addict or an alcoholic. The more of them you have, the higher the percentage becomes, right? And adverse childhood experiences are things that range from, neglect all the way to sexual abuse. So I think people who are really damaged as a child, somebody's responsible for that, right? But the problem is when we get to be an adult, and this is where I think a lot of times we get caught up here, is that even though the person was not at fault. So let's just say, let's just take Sally, right? And Sally was raped multiple times as a child, right? She was victimized horribly. It's not her fault. I wouldn't say that she's an addict or an alcoholic. It is completely her responsibility to get better, though. That's the problem, because nobody else can do it or will do it. It's not fair, but it's true.
Right. Well, and I think that's the struggle for me, right? Because essentially, if the way I see it is, if the machinery that she's using to make that choice, and the choice is required to get better, because you are in charge of your own recovery, and that doesn't only apply to addiction, that's certainly across the mental health spectrum. But if the machinery that you're using in your brain, in your body, in your society around you to make the decisions needed to get better is itself broken, or built in the wrong way because of adverse childhood experiences, then it's much more difficult, I think, to, yes, you do have that responsibility, but it's much more difficult for you to use that responsibility, I think.
Oh, it totally is. I'm fascinated by the concept of freedom of choice. How much choice do we really have? And to apply this this goes back to what we said earlier. Everybody's a result of causes and conditions, right? And at what is the choice that I have the same as somebody who was, again, to use our analogy, somebody who was abused multiple times as a child? Do we have the same level of choice when it comes to whether we put a substance abuse into our body? I don't know.
Right. Yeah, this is probably the key concept that I tried to communicate in my TED Talk in my own crude kind of way. This idea, and the talk is called "Why We Choose Suicide." Spoiler alert: the whole talk is about how we don't, because the whole idea that the thing that I was using to make this choice, my brain, was itself malfunctioning at the time. So it wasn't really a choice, even though, yes, I stand by the fact that it was a decision. It was a series of decisions. But those decisions, once all the alternatives fade away, it's not really a choice at all. And just because you can't see just because the alternatives are there, it doesn't mean that you can actually see them.
Yeah, no, I do think that is a good summary for your TED Talk. And I think it's true. I think this is one of those things, and it's having sat on both sides of this, right? It's a really, I'll call it interesting in my good moments and completely maddening in my bad moments, that idea of choice, because there are people, if you've got a mental illness, the thing that can think its way out of the problem is broken.
Right.
It's like a car, a car can't repair itself, right?
Right.
That may not be a very good analogy now that I think of it, but
Well, the car is not going to drive itself to the mechanic then.
That's right.
Because it's broken.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. That's a better use of it. And so, it gets back to this, what's the amount of choice that we have? Is everybody working from the same level of freedom of choice? And I don't think we are. The implications for that are vast. I don't know what they are. I mean, when you start taking those far enough, you start going, well, oh my goodness, what does that mean? What does that mean about the way we treat addicts and the mentally ill and criminals and all of that? What does it mean? Because the flip side of it is that there is there does have to be some degree of accountability in some way.
Sure.
The problems that are raised by that are so thorny, I don't begin to know how to unpack them. But I do think that some people are just a lot sicker than others, and I don't mean that in a negative way. I just mean that in a very true way. And the sicker you are, the harder your recovery is. I think that's true in a physical disease. I think it's true of a mental illness of any sort. And I tend to think of addiction as a mental illness. I mean, I don't know that's exactly how we classify it, but it's got a lot in common with a mental illness.
Well, and I think the researchers, clinicians, and society is moving more and more toward that direction. I think that the addictions communities and the community writ large, and the mental health community, which is now has been quite active for some time. I think there are people on both sides of that equation who would disagree. Who would say that maybe somebody with an addiction might say that they're not mentally ill. Maybe somebody with a mental illness might say the opposite. So I think there are camps on either side, but I think we're moving in that direction.
I think we're moving in that direction, yes. And I think of a lot of people who are addicts, alcoholics, have mental illness also. I think the dual diagnosis may be higher than we assume.
Yeah. So, I think it's interesting what you said about, putting my words to it, but essentially the deeper you are underwater, the longer it's going to take you to swim back to the surface, and many people drown before they're able to get back to the surface. So what can we do to effectively help people? I mean, sure, we can't make the choice for them, and we've tried for basically all of human history to force choice on people. So then how do we get them to see the light or the wisdom, or even just make the small steps necessary to improve their lives? Or should we even do that?
That question is personally sort of sitting right in the center of my life. I mean, one of my very best friends is dealing with an addiction, and it's really bad. And he's been hospitalized. He's been close to suicidal. And there doesn't there's a whole bunch of people around him who love him, who can't seem to help him get to the place where he's able to get through this. And he's gotten through it before. He got through all this before. And so right now, I mean, I'm a little bit in the throw my hands up in the air, I have no idea camp. I know what we can do can make it. I know we can make it worse. I think that's something that we tend to do. I mean, I think that if we just...
How's that?
Well, if we hound people to get better, if we tell them that they're bad, I think those are the two biggest, like really just hounding people, telling them that they're bad. The jury seems to be out on the whole tough love movement, right? It used to be fairly common wisdom, like, well, you cut somebody like that off. And I'm not sure that's the wisdom as much anymore. What I take out of it and what I've told people for years, and after having been an Al-Anon myself for years, is you do what keeps you sane.
Right. That there's a reason for the behavior somewhere under there.
There's a reason for the behavior, but you as a person who's in love with or really close to someone like that, the best thing you can do is figure out what's going to keep you from going crazy, because living with an addict or an alcoholic or being really close to one will turn you sick yourself if you're not careful.
Well, and part of free choice too, I think, is realizing that others have free choice too, that's right. That we can't control what they do, and giving up control is sometimes the hardest thing of all.
Oh, it's probably the hardest thing of all. Yeah. I feel like my spiritual life seems to be one long process in continually learning what's controllable and what's not. And spoiler alert, less of it's controllable than we think.
Yeah. So then how do you learn, especially in a relationship with somebody else who's struggling, how do you learn what's yours and what's theirs, what's in control, what's in your power versus what's not?
Well, I think getting help is really useful, going to Al-Anon or getting a therapist or finding somebody to talk to. But ultimately, what someone else chooses to do, the actions they take are not, those are not in our control.
Yeah.
We can have influence. We have influence over people for sure.
Sure. To set up the conditions for them. Yeah.
Yeah. And we can talk with people and try and help them see different perspectives, or talk about, maybe why getting sober or getting help is a good idea, or, you could do all of that. But ultimately what they're going to do is what they're going to do, which I don't think calls for like, oh, just don't do anything for them. I don't think that's it. I'll call my friend and be like, hey, would you like me to come over after you get out of treatment today? And so you got somebody around you for a little while. Like, that's a skillful way to try and help.
Right.
Oh, would you like a ride to and from? Don't have alcohol in the house. You can do things that set people up to have a higher chance of success.
Right.
But ultimately, you can't stop that choice, that ultimate choice.
One of the, I think, most challenging emotions that I've tried to help people with, and that I've experienced myself, is the guilt. When somebody else makes a choice that you had zero control over, that you had zero input on, but you really didn't want it to happen. Somebody dies by suicide, somebody overdoses, or just can't get their life to the place where that they deserve and could be if they had the right supports. What do you tell people, or maybe if you've even dealt with this yourself, to work through that guilt of not being able to help somebody?
I don't know, except to say kind of what we've talked about. It's not your fault.
Yeah.
It's not your fault. And I think this gets really difficult, particularly for parents.
Yeah. Yeah.
For parents, there's a lot of this guilt. And, I think these are the sort of situations that are better served by having a professional help you than trying to figure out by listening to a podcast.
Listen to a podcast.
I'm not saying that flippantly, nor am I saying that us talking about it on a podcast isn't a good idea, because we should. But when you start talking about things like the guilt over a child's suicide, that's the sort of thing. I don't think we're made to get through that sort of thing on our own. I think we need help. And so with addiction and mental health and all that, the system isn't perfect, but there is help. Yeah. There are places out there. There are support groups. And so I just encourage people to get to get help, and particularly family members. Like there's a reason that Al-Anon exists, and it's not a small program. There are a lot of Al-Anon meetings because what people have found over the years is you live with an alcoholic, you will start to go a little crazy. And so you go to Al-Anon and you get support. And that's the Al-Anon program. How do you stay sane? How do you drop the guilt? And how do you live best you can while somebody else really close to you is destroying their life and yours by proximity to some extent?
Yeah. I'm so glad to hear you say this because I hear from parents, to use that specific example, parents who have lost kids to suicide or, brothers or sisters, cousins that are trying to help somebody who has an addiction. And the guilt that they feel. And it is difficult, but to be able to tell them that, no, that's actually a legitimate, valid issue too, and that you don't have to go through this alone, that it's not your fault. Yes, but anybody faced with that kind of situation would be suffering with the exact same kinds of feelings. So, I think caregivers, family members, parents, these are the people who are on the front lines of mental health, on the front lines of trauma every single day, and that their role needs to be validated and that they need to be given just as much help sometimes.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, it really is so hard for people, and I think I've got a lot of experience in this area. And if my friend doesn't make it, that's going to be hard for me to deal with. And I'm going to, there's no way that I'm not going to have the questions. What could I have done? What could I have done? What could I have done? Right.
And that's normal, right? That's normal.
Right. Exactly. It's normal. And so, no, I do think that caregivers and people who are around people who are addicts or who have mental illness, those people really need support as much.
Yeah. And, I think that really realizing that there's no right or wrong way to struggle, both as a person who is struggling, but then also the person who's struggling to help the person who's struggling. There's no right or wrong way to do that. And I think that sharing these stories is important because that helps people to realize that. But also, hopefully, it opens up a door for others to get more meaningful, in-depth assistance as well.
Yes, I hope so too.
Well, this has been a really enlightening conversation for me. We've had people on the show in the past who have talked about their experience with addiction and who have talked about what they've learned from it. So what are you hoping that, somebody who's listening to this is in that fuzzy phase of realizing that their life isn't tenable the way that it is right now with the addiction that they're facing or whatever, but is still struggling to find the direction? What would you tell that person who's still trying to find their way?
I would say just keep trying. Try something and then try again and then try again and then try something else. It takes people a long time. I remember a really dark point in my life where I had gone into treatment. I came out of treatment. I'd gone to like 30 days of AA meetings. I was really serious about it. And after about 30 days, I went out and drank again. And I remember I look back on it now and I'm like, well, that's perfectly normal. But at the time, what I thought was, I'm doomed. Mm-hmm. I thought I went to treatment. I went to the meetings. I did the things they said. And here I am using again. I'm going to die this way. Mm. And what I didn't know then was this can be a multi-step process. Right. And that it was by continuing to try again and try again and try again that I eventually figured it out. And it's why the phrase in AA that is used so much is just keep coming back. Mm. Because if you keep coming back, if you keep trying, you'll find something that works. But we get discouraged very, very quickly. And I would say mental illness is very, very similar, right? Like, it can take time to find out what are the right meds for you. What are the right combinations of meds? How do they go together? All that. So it's very easy to get discouraged after we put in a really hard effort a time or two, and it seems to be for naught. It's the next time or the next time. But if we keep trying, I think we get there. And that's kind of my message I would say to people is, if you're in a spot you don't want to be in, try and make it better. And if that doesn't work, try again and try different things and ask for help, but just keep coming back.
Yeah. What are you most grateful for now in your life on the other side of that effort?
I think I'm grateful for all that it taught me about what it means to live a good life. I don't know that I would have delved as deep inside myself as early as I did if I didn't have to. Mm. And what I find is that I think most people, if they're lucky, hit the stage where they do that. where they eventually, and some of them do it on their deathbed. But most people eventually find I chased all the things in the world that I thought would make me happy, and I got some of them, and it didn't necessarily work. And so they start to go deeper. And I feel like I was kind of forced into that very early on. And I would say I'm grateful for that.
Well, it's certainly given you a lot of wisdom, Eric, and thank you so much for sharing that wisdom with me and with all of our listeners as well.
Oh, thanks so much for having me on. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
Take care. That's it. That's my conversation with Eric Zimmer on So-Called Normal. Go check out his podcast, The One You Feed, available everywhere. Check out my conversation on his podcast if you want to hear more from me for some reason. But look into all his episodes. I mean, he has so many of them now, hundreds of them, as you heard in our conversation there, and all each so unique and interesting. So go check that out. If you enjoyed our episode today, share any quotes or thoughts or questions that maybe you have had. You can connect with us on pretty much any social media, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, whatever else. I'm at Mark Hennick, at MarkHenick, and you can also check me out at markhennick.com. I want to thank our people who make this podcast possible every single week, every single Monday. The folks here at Entertainment One, producer Adrian and Kimberly, our wonderful editor Dave, who brings it all together in the end to get it out to you and into your ears. So thank you, Kimberly, Adrian, and Dave, for putting my voice in people's ears. I'd like to ask you to follow us and subscribe to the show. Head over to Apple Podcast, Google, Stitcher, Spotify, iHeartRadio, we're everywhere else, but head over to Apple Podcasts, subscribe to the show, leave us a rating at the bottom, leave some comments for us. That would be great. It really does help. And like I say, share these episodes far and wide. I think that's it for me. I don't think if I did forget anything, I'll mention it on the next one. All right, that's it. I'm Mark Hennick, and this has been So-Called Normal.